It is really a joy to have ICLE here at St. Thomas to participate in this great renewal of Catholic education. This presentation is about the story of Catholic education, which is really a story of renewal. And the contents of the talk will be actually drawn from this book that's on display here, The Heart of Culture, A Brief History of Western Education. And the book was developed from a graduate course we teach here at St. Thomas on a similar title. Actually, I just finished teaching it last week, where we had Nashville Dominicans, the handmaids, priests, laity, and it was just a wonderful experience. The story of Catholic education is a profoundly rich one because it's structured on three particular stories that we have to kind of be mindful of. The first story is a cosmic story. Catholic education is part of God's story, of His Word becoming flesh, that has simply changed everything. It is Christocentric, and actually, we can put it this way. At the heart of Catholic education is an invitation to participate in the integrating power of the incarnation in both life and thought. But it's also an institutional story that's extraordinary for multiple reasons. It is one of the longest continuous institutional story of any educational system we have. It doesn't go back to the latest fad. It doesn't go back to the 20th century. It doesn't go back to the founding of this country. It goes back 2,000 years, and in many respects, as we'll see, even longer. And it's this story that I really want to focus on this evening. But thirdly, it's also a deeply personal story. This is our story, for we are part of this story. We're part of the tradition, the narrative of Catholic education, as principals, superintendents, teachers, staff, parents, students. This is not only a story of the past, but it's still operating today. And we are not passive spectators. We have a work to be done in this story. And there's nobody who captures this question of our story and our particular work, particularly in light of God's work, than St. John Henry Newman. In one of his meditations, he puts it this way. He says, God knows me and calls me by my name. God has created me to do him some definite service. He has committed some work to me which he has not committed to another. I have my mission. I ever may know it in this life, but I shall be told it in the next. But our challenge, of course, is that for some of us, we sometimes have a hard time believing that we're part of a cosmic institutional story. And there's lots of reasons for that. The ordinary and the day-to-day can grind on us. We may have been beset by disappointments and failures from ourselves or by others. Or we may simply waste too much time on our screens, and our spirit grows dull and small. Or it may be something else. And what happens is we lose sight of the story, we lose sight of the adventure, and we disconnect from our origins, from where we came from, which then disorders our destiny about where we're going. And then it results into confusion of who we are and what our role is in education. And then we drift gradually, we assimilate, and we begin to look no different than other forms of education, except in the most superficial ways. So if we are to know who we are and where we're going as educators, we have to know where we came from. And here we need deep roots. And there's a woman named Simone Weil who I think provides us very interesting insights on this question of roots. Simone Weil was a Jewish woman, a Catholic convert, who served in the French resistance during World War II. And in 1943, she was asked to draft a plan on how to rebuild culture in France after the war. And this turned into a book called The Need for Roots. And she states in the book that one of the greatest challenges of the modern age is uprootedness, and particularly in our educational system, that tends to create what I would call the phenomenon and the syndrome of cut flowers. Things that look and smell good, but they're in the process of dying. And we'll talk more about those cut flowers a little bit later in the talk. But she talked about two particular problems in education, the loss of transcendence and the fixation on the technical and the practical. But she was keen on the importance of roots, to know our roots. And if we don't understand where we came from, we have no sense of the shoulders in which we stand, we can't grasp the role and the unique vocation the Lord has given us, and thus we're unable to participate in the profound purpose of Catholic education. So as an understanding, right, what is this understanding of the story of our tradition of Catholic education? What does it start to look like? And so here, what I'd like to do is give you the overarching art, or the overarching nature of this education, the arc of it. And here I'm quite indebted to Beth for this timeline. I'm very grateful for that. Made a few little adaptations here and there, Beth, but it was very helpful. And really, there's 4 periods here. The classical age, roughly between 500 BC to 500 AD. And here we'll see the integration of the Greco-Roman education and its founding belief of Catholicism in the Incarnation. The Middle Ages, where we see the birth of our educational institutions. The Renaissance, which in many respects is the beginning of globalization of Catholic education, largely through religious orders. And the modern age, which is actually a very complicated age, but an age of great advance, but also of significant rupture. And so in this part of the talk, I just simply want to give 3 chapters that I think highlights the importance of this story. And the first one is of this integration and the foundations that we see in the classical age. The second one is the institutionalization of Catholic education in the Middle Ages. And 3 is the rupture of the modern age and basically the battle that we're in today. So first, the classical age. In order to grasp the beginning of the story of Catholic education, we have to look to its origins. And we have to realize that there are 2 fundamental ideas, 2 forces, 2 realities that come together in a unique way. This was not an easy integration, and it took hundreds of years for it to be worked through. But I believe it is helpful to see what this foundation's about. And so the classical age is an age of integrating 2 ways of knowing. This, I think, is best articulated in a wonderful book by a Benedictine French scholar by the name of Father Jean Leclerc. It's entitled The Love of Learning and the Desire of God. So the first way of learning, the love of learning, first way of knowing, the love of learning, it's what the Greeks called paideia. It's what the Romans called humanitas. It's what we come to understand as the liberal arts. Beth gave a beautiful demonstration on that today. And the key to the premise of paideia and this way of knowing is based on the nature of the universal nature of the person. Because education is not merely the passing on of military skills, as it often was in the ancient world, because it was to protect the tribe, the race, the ethnicity. In this sense, this form of education is not racist and it's not ethnocentric. Paideia is an education that participates in the universal nature of truth and of goodness and beauty. And it raises to the importance disciplines such as philosophy and math and literature and other things that help us to understand the universal nature of what the human person is. But the second form of knowing is a very different form of knowing, and it's found in the nature of God and the seeking of God. And this desire for God is found in revelation. And this desire is not achieved by some great philosophical quest, but it's achieved by a God who's revealed himself in revelation, a gift of faith. It's not grasped at, but it's rather a gift to be received. And at the heart of this revelatory gift is the Incarnation. And the Incarnation is most poetically expressed in the prologue of the Gospel of John, right? That in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. By the way, the icon that's there is an icon called Jesus the Teacher. It's actually in my building, which is right down the street on Summit Avenue, on the corner of Cleveland and Summit. You're all welcome to see it. It's right outside a beautiful gem of a chapel we have, and you're always welcome anytime while you're here or if you're even later. But what's extraordinary about the claims of Christianity is that Christ is the Logos, the Word made flesh. And you know that Logos means word, but it also means in Greek, reason. And it is here that we see the very foundation of Catholic education. that Christ, who is the Logos, is divine reason. And we are made in the image of this divine reason, and we are made to know. And that all of creation is made by the Logos and is imprinted upon it a created order which we can grasp. That all creation has an intelligibility to it, has a pattern to it. And one of the greatest lines, and I love this line by Albert Einstein, right? The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible, right? And one way that we comprehend this creation is through the disciplines of reasoned discourse in education. And thus, we have these series of disciplines or subjects, patterns of intelligibility, forms of reason that enables us to see the world. So biology, the logos of living things; geology, the logos of the earth; psychology, the logos of the human mind; sociology, the logos of the social; and theology, right? God is logos. Faith seeking understanding, faith seeking reason. And all these disciplines are not discrete forms of intellectual inquiry, disconnected from each other, but they form a unity of knowledge of which we can participate in the divine reason of a created order. And here we come to the deep truth about our tradition. Faith in God is not unreasonable. Although it is beyond reason, it never contradicts reason. And what the incarnation and the logos of divine reason brings to liberal education, of which the Greeks and the Romans could not, is the fundamental confidence of a revelation of God who is made flesh, who redeems all. That Christ is all and in all. That the material world as an ordered expression of the mind of God is worthy of esteem and study. That science could be explored with the faith that all learning is unified in the mind of the Creator. And by the way, it's the simple fact, Catholic schools don't simply make Bible schools or seminaries. They created schools to explore all disciplines, but in a united way, not in a fragmented one. And so here, a lot more could be said on the classical period, but let's move to period number 2, the Middle Ages, the institutionalization of education. The classical period comes to an end, largely from external invasions and internal corruptions. The external invasions, largely beginning in the 5th century after Christ, there's a serious decline, especially in cities, from the various invasions, from the Huns, the Franks, the Vandals, the Saxons, the Visigoths. But there's also internal corruptions that are occurring. And the cities are suffering from its own internal problems of wealth and power and things of this sort. You probably have heard this quote, right, that a great civilization is not conquered from without until it has destroyed itself from within. And both the external invasions and internal corruptions had devastating effects on the cities. Rome, for example, at the time of Christ was nearly 1 million people. In the 5th and 6th century, it's less than 100,000 people. And these invasions pounded the West, and it devastated the establishment of Roman rule, but it weakened the schools of classical learning. And this is where we begin to see the demise of literacy, the loss of skill, and the loss of building. It is what we call often the Dark Ages. While not altogether true, it's actually not altogether false either. And it is out of this destruction that comes the church's educational institutions. As they often say, the fruit grows in the valleys, not often on the mountaintops. And 3 different types of institutions appear. First, the monasteries, and St. Benedict being the most important person in that monastery renewal. The monasteries, by the way, had one principle. Their fundamental principle was the search for God. But this God was found in the Word, in Scripture, and thus people needed to know how to read. And this God was also found in worship, in music. By the way, the music was spectacular today, liturgy. Thank you. Just spectacular. That church hasn't sounded that well for a long time, so thank you. I shouldn't say that too loud, but it was really wonderful. It's very interesting, by the way, the word enchantment. The monks lived in an enchanted world. By the way, the word enchantment comes from a Latin word, which means to sing into, right? And so the monks learned how to read, and they learned how to sing, and they were educated. Now, by the way, in that process, they preserved the intellectual and cultural heritage of the ancient world, but that was not their intent. It was simply a byproduct of the search for God, because that was their main motive. And they became some of the most learned people in Europe at the time. But here's what happens, though. The church looks to the monks, and they called these monks to become servants in the church. And they become the bishops, and they move back into the cities. And they take over these cities, and particularly they begin to build cathedrals. And it's in these cathedral schools that a new form of education starts to occur. It's very interesting, right, that over time, as Germanic invaders came in and destroyed the cities, they became conquered by the faith of those they invaded. And the cities that became destroyed had renewal. And thus you see the cathedrals of Chartres and Notre Dame and Toledo, Siena, Venice, and Cologne. These schools that came out of the cathedral schools became the central educational hub at that particular time. And it's out of these cathedral schools that come the universities of Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Salamanca, Cambridge. John Paul II wrote an encyclical letter, or apostolic letter, on Catholic universities in 1990. It's called Ex Corde Ecclesiae. Out of the heart of the church came universities. The fact of this is actually lost on most modern people, that our university system came out of the church. One interesting also note about these universities, of 85 institutions in the West that was established before 1520, 70 of them are universities, and they were started off as Catholic universities. It's a very interesting process, universities. This picture actually is a depiction of one of the first classrooms of Bologna, and it's often considered the first university in the West. If you study it carefully, you see a couple of interesting things. The first thing you see is a student snoozing. In the back row, you got these two kids yucking it up in the back of while the professor lectures. And then in the front row, you got this kid beaming, right, with earnest fervor. And of course, the professor all has a beard, right? Some things just never change. But the significance of these institutions should never be underestimated. Think about it for this way. The Catholic Church has 95,000 primary schools worldwide, 43,000 secondary schools, and 1,400 institutions of higher learning. Where did that come from? Where did it start, right? It started here. It started in this tradition. It took a long time for it to be built in, and we play a role in continuing it into the future. There's, again, a lot more contributions to be made about the medieval period, but let me move to our third chapter, the modern period. Like all periods, this one is of immense complexity, and it may be the most difficult to talk about since we're in it. And let's never underestimate that this age has provided us great advance and great benefit. Science and technology, health and medicine, economic development, political democracy. We have been very blessed in the modern period. But the modern period is also an age of rupture, especially in its relationship to Catholic education. And this exploded onto the scene with the French Revolution in 1789. Unlike the American Revolution, which was simply a political revolution, the French Revolution was both a political and a cultural revolution, and it sought to eliminate much of what was in culture at the time. It wanted to eliminate history. For example, there was proposed a new calendar, the French Revolutionary calendar, where 1792, which was the year the French Republic was established, would become year one. And the establishment of the new state, not the birth of Christ, would be the new measure and ever-present reminder of the flow of time. It also sought to eliminate the church. The churches across France at this time were desecrated and turned into temples of reason. The largest ceremony was actually at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, where Christ was replaced by the goddess of reason. It also closed the University of Paris with its theological faculties, which was one of the first universities in the medieval period, and was largely replaced by the École Polytechnique, forming civil servants simply from scientific and technical expertise. This event, along with many other events and many other issues that, in a sense, were around it, led to a different set of principles that creates for us a way of understanding the rupture that we're also facing with modernity. Let me highlight two of those principles. The first principle is where the primacy of reason alone over faith and reason. Whereas in the Christian tradition, faith and reason brings together the deepest dimensions of wisdom. But the increasing assumption in the modern age is that faith and reason have nothing to do with each other. Faith is at best emotive, at worst superstitious, and it simply has no connection to reason. And so reason becomes the only genuine source of knowledge. This modern principle is actually particularly manifested in higher education, but I actually think it's all over the place, and it starts very young. But in modern higher education, you see the distancing of universities from their founding congregations. You see the decline of theology in the university, and even now the decline of humanities. And you also see the increasing dominance of sciences in professional schools. And what's really interesting, by the way, if you look at how universities, their seals have been redesigned. It's a very interesting one. Let me give you an example of Harvard. Harvard is the oldest university in the US. It was, by the way, founded by the Christian Congregationalists. Some other things to be reminded of. University of Chicago, Brown University, founded by Baptist. University of Southern California, Duke University, Boston University, Methodists. Princeton, Presbyterians. But in the original seal in Harvard in 1692, Veritas is at the beginning, at the center, truth. But what's embedding truth? What embeds it? Christo Ecclesiae, Christ and his church, faith and reason. The new seal, just truth. And even that, we even wonder whether that's there as well. But it's a truth that's autonomous. And the problem with the autonomous truth is that it increasingly gets reduced to technical and scientific truth, and it no longer engages the question of moral and spiritual truth. And what happens when we lose faith, when it gets alienated from reason? As great as Harvard is, and Harvard is great, it has the most Nobel laureates of any university in the US, but it has been critiqued by many of its own faculty and administrators for losing its soul. This critique was made forcefully by the former dean of Harvard College. His name was Harry Lewis, in a book he wrote called Education Without a Soul: How a Great University Forgot Education. Another Harvard professor, Rakesh Khurana, in the business school, wrote a very interesting book critiquing the business school that says, From higher aims to hired hands. What both professors lament is a loss of substance. While Harvard may have achieved a high level of academic excellence, it lost a moral and spiritual integration that captures the dimensions of humanity. And without faith in the picture of education, we come to a second principle that I think is particularly dangerous. And the second principle is the primacy of action over contemplation. Pope Benedict, in his wonderful, simple, but profound way, once said that the most profound moment of our lives is not what we've achieved, but what we have received. But the modern age often tells us something different. It has brought to us a culture that is highly pragmatic, hyperactive, career-oriented, and it simply pumps us with the illusion that everything is socially constructed and nothing is given. There are few principles that we have not escaped in catching this disease, and it is a serious problem. Let me give you an example of modern history that catches this particular problem. In 1947, Joseph Pieper wrote a fascinating book called Leisure, the Basis of Culture. I noticed that there's a session on this tomorrow. Think about that for a moment. 1947, he writes a book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, in Germany. Right? Germany at the time has been decimated by the Allies during World War II. Right? It doesn't need leisure, it needs pragmatic solutions. Don't give me this. And the book appeared to be one more example of one more academic whose isolation in the ivory tower simply prevented him from understanding the world in which he lived. And yet Pieper anticipated such objections. And in the first page of that book, he writes this: "To build our house at this time implies not only securing survival, but also putting in order again our entire moral and intellectual heritage. And before any detailed plan along these lines can succeed, our new beginning, our refoundation, calls out immediately for a defense of leisure." Why leisure? When we look at our lives in terms of the primacy of the work, of the pragmatic, of the active life, it eventually runs into the culture of death. Pieper was very aware that the Nazi slogan over the gate of Auschwitz and other concentration camps, "Arbeit macht frei," work will set you free. It will not. It will enslave you to an ideology, whether that ideology is German Nazism, whether it's Soviet communism, or to be quite frank, if it's American capitalism. There are lots of trends in education that's premised on this fundamental primacy of the active over the contemplative. Pragmatism. The ism of the pragmatic jettisons metaphysics and theology, and that all we need to do is simply get to what works, what's useful. The primacy of the active is a wonder killer, and it deflates the love of learning. The pragmatist, again, in the words of Pope Benedict, he says, "The pragmatist views reality essentially from a functional point of view. He no longer approaches the world from the viewpoint of contemplation and wonder, but as one who measures, weighs, and acts." And this pragmatism increasingly, quite quickly, goes into a form of careerism. Careerism. Education is increasingly based on its simply instrumental value to career. Learning is justified for what? In order to get good grades, to get good scores, to get to the school of choice, to get to the good career. By the way, this is a common complaint among my students. And the dialogue goes like this: "So like Dr. Naughton, like why do I gotta take theology and philosophy? Like what is it gonna do for my career?" So the first thing I tell them, stop saying like, right? But anyhow, it's the major filler of youth. We all have our fillers, but that's one of their problems. And so what I tell them, I say, leisure, the basis of culture. Joseph Pieper, he actually talks about the etymological linkages of this idea of leisure. And he says that the Greek word for leisure is the origin of the Latin schola, which means in English, the word school. And so I tell my students, you are at leisure. And that's exactly what they do, right? They look at me and say, I don't think so, Dr. Naughton. I don't think so, right? And yet there's also an increasingly difficult problem that's occurring right now in education, and we're hearing more and more about it. It's a philosophy of education called critical theory that claims that everything is socially constructed, including marriage, religion, gender, and nothing is given. Critical theory draws upon Karl Marx's claim that philosophy, and particularly education, is not to understand the world, but it's to change it. And thus, education is not about the understanding of reality, of its truth, goodness, and beauty. Such categories within this theory is constructs that simply see it as oppression. And rather, according to this critical theory, education should be a process of deconstructing, debunking our current institutions, right? This is the kind of challenge that we are facing. It has multiple dimensions to it. Now let's be clear, it's good to be pragmatic. I am concerned about the careers of my students, and I am very concerned about social justice. But when these items are severed from this idea of contemplation, they disorder education in a very serious way. Leisure is the attitude of the mind, the condition of the soul, to receive the reality of the world. It's a contemplative outlook. And this is exactly what we're going to be doing in the next several days. I looked over this schedule. It is a beautiful schedule. of this contemplative reality, of literature, of stories that reveal the human condition, of creation and sin and redemption, of art and music that stirs our sentiments of nobility and transcendence and connects us to nature and humanity and God. Math and science that opens us to the world of wonder and order, that it is a world that's given to us. It's not a world that's constructed. And religion, liturgy, is all about that search for God. So, let me begin to conclude. This institutional story of Catholic education, as we mentioned at the beginning of the talk, is embedded in a cosmic story of God's incarnation, and we are part of that story. Our role, our vocation as Catholic school educators, by the way, is no less than the saving of culture, because that's what education should be about. And yet our role cannot happen without God's grace in our lives and the assistance of the Church through her sacraments and teachings. And so I'd like to end my talk and this evening with a short meditation, which I hope can bring you a sense of God's grace in our lives, and particularly in the pursuit of this work we call Catholic education. The meditation is given by a former colleague of mine, Don Brill, who is the founder of Catholic Studies here at St. Thomas, an extraordinary man. And the words you are about to hear come from an interview that he gave in a documentary from a documentary group called 1 Billion Stories. And the words you're going to hear was about 1 week before he died. And he knew he was dying, and that he was coming to the end of this earthly story and moving to an eternal one. And he had a deep sense of God's grace in his life, and particularly how the Church mediated that grace in his work as a Catholic educator. His words in his impending death come in the form of counsels to former students, which brings to us a wisdom that I hope can help us as we begin this conference. I do hope you find these words helpful.
It's very interesting. After my illness was diagnosed, I've had many dozens of former students come to me. And often they will ask me what advice I have to give them at this stage in life. And because Newman's vision of the fact that we have a work that is given to us on which the plan of salvation depends, I mean, he will say that God could give it to another, but in fact, this is the deep invitation in each of our lives that we have this great dignity. We're meant for a purpose which we can't fully grasp. So if that's true, then the main purpose in life is to be attentive to the working of grace that invites us to understand that work more deeply and to participate in it more fully. So I think that's the real key, because so often, out of goodwill, we'll often think, what am I called to do? But then we become concerned about a work. But in fact, what God is inviting is a transformation of life and its purpose, not simply a work to be done.
Thank you, and good night.